The message came without warning on a Tuesday morning in the year 2347. Every screen on Earth flickered at the same moment, and every radio station went silent before a new voice filled the airwaves, and every neural implant connected to the global network received the same transmission. Ambassador Kethvern of the Vectory Dominion appeared before humanity for the first time, and his face was not something humans had ever imagined in their wildest dreams or their darkest nightmares. His skin was like black glass stretched over sharp bones, and his eyes were clusters of smaller eyes that moved independently like insects trapped in amber, and when he spoke his mouth split in 3 directions, revealing teeth that seemed to go back forever. Into his skull, he spoke in perfect English because the Vectory had been watching humanity for decades and learning everything they needed to know. People of Earth, Kethvern said in a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed under heavy machinery, the Vectory Dominion has claimed your star system as territory of the Eternal Empire, and you will surrender unconditionally within 30 of your Earth days. He paused, and those horrible cluster eyes seemed to look at every human being individually. You will dismantle your orbital stations and your defense platforms and your pathetic little fleet of ships, and you will present your world leaders to us for processing and reassignment, and you will accept your new role as a labor species in service to the Dominion. The transmission showed what waited beyond Jupiter, and the sight made grown men weep and children scream. 12,000 warships hung in the darkness of space, and each one was larger than anything humanity had ever built, and together they blocked out the stars, themselves like a wall of death waiting to fall upon the Earth. We have conquered 847 species. Kethvern continued with what might have been boredom in his alien voice. And not one of them has ever successfully resisted us, and your species will not be the first. And resistance is mathematically impossible, and you would be wise to accept this truth. The transmission ended, and Earth fell into chaos in the streets of New York and Tokyo and London and Mumbai and snow. Palo and Lagos people ran and screamed and prayed to whatever gods they believed in, and some people tried to pretend nothing had happened, and some people began building bunkers in their backyards, as if that would help against a fleet of 12,000 alien warships. The world governments held emergency meetings, and generals shouted at politicians, and politicians shouted at each other, and everyone agreed that the situation was hopeless. Earth's public defense fleet consisted of exactly 237 ships, and most of them were patrol vessels designed to chase away pirates and smugglers, and none of them had ever fired a shot in actual combat. The mathematics were simple and brutal and undeniable. 200 against 12,000 was not a battle but an execution. But deep beneath the surface of the moon, in a facility that appeared on no map and existed in no official record, a different kind of meeting was taking place. Admiral Yuki Tanaka walked through corridors carved from lunar rock, and she walked with the confidence of someone who knew something that the rest of humanity did not. She was 63 years old, with gray hair cut short in military fashion, and eyes that had seen things she could never speak about in public, and she had waited her entire career for this moment. The United Earth Command Council sat around a table made of polished metal, and their faces showed the same fear that gripped the rest of humanity. But underneath that fear was something else, something like anticipation. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Tanaka said as she took her place at the head of the table, the enemy has arrived exactly as we predicted 300 years ago. She touched a control panel, and the air above the table came alive with light and images. The Vectory have made a critical error in their assessment of humanity, and they have made the same error that every species makes when they look at us, and they have assumed that what they see is all there is. The hologram showed Earth's public fleet, and then it showed the Vectory Armada, and the comparison was laughable. They counted our ships, and they measured our industrial capacity, and they analyzed our technology, and they concluded that we pose no threat, and By their calculations, we should surrender immediately, because fighting would be pointless. Admiral Tanaka smiled. And it was not a warm smile, but the smile of a predator that had been waiting in the tall grass for its prey to wander close enough. They never considered the possibility that we might be lying. She touched another control, and the hologram changed completely. The council members leaned forward, even though they already knew what they were about to see, because seeing it never got old, and it never failed to fill them with something that felt like hope mixed with pride, mixed with savage joy. Ships appeared in the hologram, and they kept appearing and appearing and appearing until the display could barely contain them all. Current Ghost Fleet complement stands at 47,000 combat-ready vessels, with another 16,000 in rapid deployment reserve, and we have weapons that the Vectri have never seen and could not imagine, and we have been preparing for this exact scenario since the year 2047. One of the council members spoke up, and her voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she was asking. And the Judgment-class vessels. Admiral Tanaka's smile grew wider. 7 operational and ready for deployment. The hologram shifted one more time, and 7 shapes materialized, and each one was the size of a small moon and bristling with weapons that seemed to bend light around them in ways that hurt to look at directly. The Vectri think they are predators, and they think we are prey, and they think this will be easy, and they think wrong. Admiral Tanaka looked around the table at the men and women who had kept humanity's greatest secret for 3 centuries. It is time to wake up the Ghost Fleet, and it is time to show the galaxy what happens when you threaten the human race. And it is time to teach the Vectri Dominion a lesson they will never forget. She stood straight and tall, and her voice rang with absolute certainty. They demanded our surrender, but what they are going to get is Earth's final war fleet, and they are going to learn that humanity does not kneel, and humanity does not break, and humanity does not surrender. The council rose to their feet, and for the first time since the alien transmission, the people in that room felt something other than fear. They felt ready. The countdown to humanity's answer had begun. 300 years before the Vectri arrived, humanity had nearly destroyed itself. The resource wars of the 2040s had killed 2 billion people and turned half the planet into radioactive wasteland and brought civilization to the edge of total collapse. Nations had launched nuclear weapons at each other over oil and water, and survivors had crawled out of the ashes wondering how they could have been so stupid and so blind and so eager to murder their own kind. From that darkness, the United Earth Compact was born, and for the first time in history, humanity spoke with one voice and worked toward one goal. But the founders of the Compact were not fools, and they were not optimists, and they had learned something terrible. From the resource wars, they had learned that the universe did not care about fairness or justice or survival, and that the strong took what they wanted from the weak, and that the only way to survive was to be stronger than anything that might come for you. So they asked themselves a question that would shape the next 3 centuries of human history. What happens when something worse than us comes along? The answer was Project Lazarus. It began in 2047 with a small group of scientists and military leaders who understood that humanity was not alone in the universe, and that first contact might not be friendly, and that the species who prepared for the worst would be the species who survived. They started small with secret research, facilities hidden in remote locations, and budgets buried so deep in classified documents that even most world leaders did not know they existed. The first breakthrough came in 2089 when humanity cracked the secret of faster-than-light travel, and the public celebration was enormous. But what the public never knew was that the technology had actually been discovered 15 years earlier and kept hidden while the military applications were developed in secret. By 2100, humanity had established colonies on Mars and the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and the public believed these were civilian settlements focused on mining and research. They were not. Beneath the ice of Europa, massive shipyards carved caverns large enough to hold vessels that dwarfed anything the public had ever seen. And in the asteroid belt, factories disguised as mining operations produced weapons that broke the known laws of physics. Every generation, new leaders were brought into the secret and sworn to silence. And every generation, the Ghost Fleet grew larger and more powerful. The genius of Project Lazarus was not just the ships or the weapons, but the deception. Humanity presented itself to the universe as a young and weak species just beginning to explore beyond its home world and struggling with basic technology and posing no threat to anyone. The public defense fleet was kept deliberately small and deliberately primitive, and every time someone suggested building more ships or developing better weapons, the Council found ways to block the proposals without revealing why. To the watching galaxy, humanity looked like easy prey. That was exactly what the Council wanted. By 2200, the Ghost Fleet numbered 10,000 ships, and by 2300, it had grown to over 60,000, and the weapons technology had advanced so far beyond public knowledge that it might as well have been magic. Admiral Yuki Tanaka's grandmother had been one of the original Project Lazarus scientists, and her mother had commanded the first Judgment-class vessel during its test flights, and Yuki herself had spent her entire life preparing for the moment when humanity's secret would finally be revealed. She stood now in the command center of Lunar Base Omega, watching the Ghost Fleet begin its awakening. Across the solar system, ships that had drifted cold and dead for decades suddenly blazed with power as their crews received the activation signal and emerged from cryogenic sleep in the asteroid belt. Automated factories that had been building weapons in secret for centuries began loading their stockpiles onto transport vessels around Jupiter and Saturn. Defense platforms that had posed as abandoned satellites revealed their true nature as their weapon systems came online for the first time, and in 7 hidden locations scattered throughout the outer solar system, the Judgment-class vessels began their final preparation. These were humanity's ultimate weapons, and each one was 300 kilometers long and powered by technology that even most Ghost Fleet personnel did not fully understand. They could fold space itself and create artificial gravity wells and fire weapons that did not destroy matter, but simply erased it from existence. They were named after human concepts that embodied determination and defiance. The unconquered and the unbroken and the undying and the unyielding and the unbowed and the undefeated, and finally the flagship that Admiral Tanaka herself would command humanity's answer. The victory had given Earth 30 days to surrender, and already 5 days had passed while the Ghost Fleet assembled. Admiral Tanaka watched the holographic display showing thousands of green dots converging from every corner of the solar system, and each dot represented a warship crewed by men and women who had trained their entire lives for this fight. She thought about all the generations who had kept the secret, and all the sacrifices that had been made, and all the lies that had been told to protect this moment. She thought about her grandmother who had died believing she would never see the fruits of her work, and her mother who had passed away just 3 years ago, still waiting for the enemy that everyone knew would eventually come. Now the enemy was here, and humanity was ready. Status report, she said quietly. 42,000 vessels currently active and en route to staging positions. Her aide responded. Another 21,000 will be online within 72 hours, and all 7 Judgment-class vessels report ready for deployment. Tanaka nodded and felt the weight of 300 years of preparation settling onto her shoulders. The Victory had 12,000 ships, and they thought that made them invincible. They were about to learn what humanity had been building in the darkness while pretending to be weak and afraid. Send word to all fleet commanders, Admiral Tanaka said with iron in her voice. Project Lazarus is now active, and the Ghost Fleet rises, and today we show the universe what humanity truly is. The message went out at the speed of light, and across the solar system 63,000 Warships heard the call and prepared for war. The secret of Sol was a secret no more. Day 15 of the ultimatum arrived, and Ambassador Kethvorn grew impatient. He stood on the bridge of the Vectory flagship, Eternal Dominion, and watched the blue marble of Earth floating in the distance and wondered why these primitive creatures had not yet surrendered. Every other species faced with the might of the Dominion had submitted within days, and most had surrendered the moment they saw the Armada, and none had ever required a demonstration of power. But humanity remained silent and defiant, and their world leaders had stopped responding to communications, and something about their behavior made Kethvorn uneasy in ways he could not quite explain. Perhaps they need encouragement, suggested Fleet Commander Tor Vex, who stood beside the ambassador. Perhaps they do not truly understand what our weapons can do. Kethvorn's cluster eyes moved in agreement. Take 300 vessels and approach their inner system and destroy one of their orbital stations and show them the price of resistance. Tor Vex bowed and departed to carry out his orders, and within hours, a demonstration fleet had broken away from the main armada and was burning toward Earth at maximum speed. The 300 Vectory warships were each capable of leveling a city from orbit, and together they represent more firepower than humanity's entire public fleet. They crossed the orbit of Jupiter with weapons charged and shields raised, and crews eager to remind these foolish humans of their place in the galactic order. They never saw the mines. The first explosion came from empty space where nothing should have existed, and it tore through a Vectory cruiser like a fist through wet paper. Before anyone could react, a second explosion destroyed another ship, and then a third, and then space itself seemed to erupt in a chain of devastating blasts. What is happening? Tor Vex screamed as his display showed ship after ship vanishing from the tactical map. The answer came in the form of weapons platforms that had been hiding in the asteroid belt for 200 years and attack drones that emerged from the ice of distant moons, and ships that had been drifting cold and dead suddenly blazing with power and fury. The Vectory demonstration fleet found itself surrounded by enemies that should not have existed and could not have existed, and yet were very real and very deadly. Human vessels moved with a coordination that the Vectory had never encountered, and their weapons punched through shields that should have been impenetrable, and their tactics shifted and adapted faster than any enemy the Dominion had ever faced. Fleet Commander Tor Vex tried to rally his forces and tried to form defensive formations and tried to fight back with all the power at his command. It was not enough. In 11 minutes, the demonstration fleet ceased to exist. Of 300 Vectory warships, exactly 17 managed to escape back toward the main armada, and those 17 were badly damaged, and their crews were traumatized by what they had witnessed back on the Eternal Dominion. Ambassador Kethvorn received the news with something his species had not felt in 10,000 years of conquest: fear. Before he could process what had happened, a new transmission arrived from Earth, and this time it was the humans who had a message to deliver. The screen showed a human female in a military uniform sitting in what appeared to be the command chair of a warship, and behind her, through the Camerth viewport, Kethvorn could see something that made his cluster eyes freeze in their sockets. Ships were emerging from the darkness, and they kept emerging and emerging until the space behind the human was filled with warships as far as the sensors could detect. Ambassador Kethvorn, the human said, and her voice was calm and controlled and utterly without fear. My name is Admiral Yuki Tanaka of the United Earth Ghost Fleet, and I have a message for the Vectory Dominion. She leaned forward slightly, and her eyes held something that Kethvorn recognized from his own species, the look of a predator. You came to our system, and you threatened our world, and you demanded our surrender, and you assumed that we were weak and helpless, and that we would simply bow before your power. The Admiral smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. You were wrong. The holographic display behind her changed to show a tactical map, and Kethvorn felt his heart stop as he processed what he was seeing. The human fleet numbered in the tens of thousands, and they had somehow hidden this entire force within their own solar system, and the Vectri had never detected even a hint of their existence. Here is humanity's counteroffer. Admiral Tanaka continued, "You will withdraw your fleet from our system within 30 days, and you will surrender your fleet commanders to face trial for crimes against sentient species, and you will provide reparations to every civilization. You have conquered, and you will never threaten Earth again." She paused, and her smile grew wider. "Resistance, I am told, is mathematically futile." The transmission ended and silence fell on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion ambassador Kethforn. Stared at the blank screen and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly, and tried to calculate how a species they had dismissed as primitives could have assembled such a force in secret for the first time in the history of the Vectri Dominion. The conquerors did not know what to do next. Fleet Commander Torvex limped onto the bridge with burns covering half his body and looked at the ambassador with haunted eyes. "They were waiting for us," he whispered. "They knew we were coming, and they were ready, and their weapons and their tactics and their coordination were nothing like anything in our records. And Ambassador, we have made a terrible mistake." Kethvern turned to face the distant son of this system and thought about the humans and their secret fleet and their impossible defiance. He had two choices now. He could accept their terms and retreat in shame and become the first Vectri commander in history to surrender to a conquered species, or he could attack with everything he had and trust that the Dominion's 10,000 years of military experience would overcome whatever tricks the humans had prepared. His pride made the decision for him. "All ships prepare for battle," Ambassador Kethvern commanded. "We will show these humans what happens to species that dare to challenge the Dominion." It was the last mistake he would ever make. The Battle of the Outer Reach began near Saturn's rings on day 22 of the ultimatum. The full Vectri armada advanced in perfect formation with 12,000 warships, arranged in patterns that had crushed 847 species before humanity, and Fleet Commander Torvex, despite his wounds, insisted on leading the assault from the front. They expected the humans to run or to hide or to fight in desperate scattered groups like every other species faced with overwhelming Dominion power. Instead, the Ghost Fleet met them head-on. Admiral Tanaka had positioned her forces using Saturn's rings as cover, and the ice and rock provided concealment for thousands of smaller attack craft while the main battle fleet waited. In precise formations, all ships engage, she commanded from the bridge of the U.East Defiance. Show them what 300 years of preparation looks like. The two fleets collided in a storm of energy and metal, and Death Vectri weapons fired beams of superheated plasma that could melt through conventional armor in seconds. But Human Shield's technology had advanced far beyond anything the Dominion had ever encountered, and their shots splashed harmlessly against barriers that glowed and held firm. Human weapons were something else entirely. Gravity lances pulled Vectri ships out of formation and sent them spinning helplessly into their own allies. And probability disruptors caused enemy weapons to malfunction at critical moments, and quantum torpedoes did not explode, but instead collapsed their targets into points of infinite density that swallowed everything nearby. The Vectri had never seen such weapons, and had never imagined such weapons, and their tactical computers struggled to adapt to technologies that seemed to break the fundamental laws of physics. But the Dominion had not conquered the galaxy through luck or through numbers alone. Fleet Commander Torvex recognized that his standard tactics were failing, and he began improvising, and his crews followed his lead with the discipline of warriors who had fought 1,000 battles. Vectri ships stopped trying to match the humans in direct combat, and instead began using their superior numbers to overwhelm individual human vessels. With concentrated fire from multiple directions, they sacrificed ships deliberately to create debris fields that blocked human sensors, and they used their own wounded vessels as shields to close the distance for point-blank attacks. The battle became a grinding, brutal affair of attrition and adaptation. For every Vectory ship destroyed the humans, lost one of their own, and for every human tactic, the Dominion found a counter, and for every Dominion counter, the humans developed a new approach. Days passed, and the space around Saturn became a graveyard of shattered vessels from both sides. Admiral Tanaka watched her fleet strength diminish and felt the weight of every death pressing down on her shoulders, and wondered if 300 years of preparation would be enough. By day 22, the Ghost Fleet had lost 9,000 ships, and the Vectory had lost 8,000, and the mathematics still favored the Dominion because they could afford to trade losses and humanity. Could not, Admiral? Her tactical officer reported with exhaustion in his voice. At current attrition rates, we will be reduced to combat ineffective status within 72 hours, and the enemy will still have sufficient forces to threaten Earth. Tanaka nodded slowly and looked at the holographic display showing the positions of both fleets. The time had come. Signal the Judgment-class vessels, she said quietly. Tell them to begin their approach. Across the solar system, 7 moon-sized shapes began to move. The Vectory detected them almost immediately, and Fleet Commander Torvex felt a chill run through his exoskeleton as his sensors struggled to classify what they were seeing. What are those? Ambassador Kethvern demanded from the bridge of the Eternal Dominion before anyone could answer the first. Judgment-class vessel dropped out of fold space directly in the center of the Vectory formation. The Unconquered was 300 kilometers long and covered in weapons arrays that pulsed with energy that made space itself ripple and distort. It did not fire in any conventional sense. Instead, reality bent around it, and Victory ships simply ceased to exist as the fabric of space-time twisted and tore and unmade everything it touched. The second Judgment-class vessel appeared moments later, and then the third, and then all 7 were among the enemy fleet, and the slaughter began in earnest. Vectory commanders screamed orders that their crews could not follow because there was no defense against weapons that erased matter from existence, and no formation that could withstand attacks that came from directions that should not have existed. Fleet Commander Torvex tried to rally his remaining forces and tried to concentrate fire on the massive human vessels, but their shields absorbed everything the Dominion could throw at them without even flickering. Retreat. Ambassador Kethvern finally ordered as he watched ship after ship vanish from his display. All ships retreat immediately. But the Ghost Fleet had anticipated this moment, and human vessels moved to cut off the Dominion's escape routes while the Judgment-class ships continued their devastating assault. The Eternal Dominion tried to run, and its engines burned at maximum power as it fled toward the edge of the solar system. Admiral Tanaka aboard Humanity's Answer watched the enemy flagship flee and gave it exactly 30 seconds of head start. It was not enough. Humanity's Answer folded space and appeared directly in front of the Eternal Dominion, and for one long moment, the 2 flagships faced each other. Ambassador Kethvern looked at the human vessel that blocked his escape, and finally understood the full magnitude of his mistake. This is Admiral Tanaka. The human's voice came through the communication system. You demanded our surrender, and instead you got our answer. The weapons of Humanity's Answer powered up, and the Eternal Dominion ceased to exist with the death of their flagship and their cause. Ambassador, the remaining Vectory vessels stopped fighting. Of 12,000 Dominion warships that had entered the solar system, fewer than 2,000 remained, and those survivors powered down their weapons and sent signals of surrender to the Ghost Fleet. The Battle of the Outer Reach was over. Humanity had won. The surrender ceremony took place on Earth 3 months after the Battle of the Outer Reach. Fleet Commander Torvex knelt before the United Earth Council in the Great Hall of the rebuilt United Nations building, and he was the highest-ranking Vectory officer to survive the war, and now he represented what remained of the Dominion. The terms were absolute and non-negotiable. The Vecturi would release all 847 species they had conquered over 10,000 years of expansion, and they would provide reparations to those species across the next 3 centuries, and their military would be reduced to purely defensive capabilities, and they would never again threaten any world that did not threaten them first. Most importantly, they would answer to a new governing body that humanity had proposed. The Galactic Compact would unite the formerly conquered species under a framework of mutual defense and shared governance, and Earth would serve as its founding member and guarantor of peace. Torvex pressed his forehead to the cold floor and spoke the words of surrender that no Vecturi had ever spoken before. The Dominion accepts these terms, and we submit to the authority of the Galactic Compact, and we acknowledge the sovereignty of Earth, and we will honor this agreement for as long as our species exists. Admiral Yuki Tanaka watched the ceremony from her seat among the council members and felt a strange mixture of triumph and exhaustion. She had lost 20,000 ships and hundreds of thousands of brave men and women who had given their lives to protect their homeworld, and the victory had cost humanity more than anyone would ever truly understand. That they had won. They had faced an enemy that had conquered the galaxy, and they had not surrendered, and they had not broken, and they had proven that humanity would never kneel to any power in the universe. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy transformed liberated species, emerged from centuries of oppression, and looked upon humanity with something between awe and terror and gratitude, and they sent ambassadors to Earth and requested membership in the Galactic Compact, and pledged their support to the species that had done what no one else could do. The Ghost Fleet revealed itself fully for the first time, and ships that had hidden in the darkness for generations now patrolled the space lanes as peacekeepers and protectors. Human technology that had been kept secret for 300 years was shared with the former subjects, species, and civilizations that had been held back by Dominion control began to advance and grow and flourish. Admiral Tanaka gave her final address as military commander from the steps of the United Nations building on a clear spring morning, when the sky was blue and the birds were singing and the world seemed more hopeful than it had in centuries. Billions of people watched on screens across Earth, and millions more watched from colonies throughout the solar system, and countless aliens from dozens of species watched from worlds scattered across the galaxy. They asked us once. Tanaka began, and her voice carried across the crowd. Centuries ago, when Project Lazarus first began, and they asked what we were preparing for, and what enemy could possibly justify such secrecy, and such expense, and such obsession. She paused, and looked up at the sky where she knew the Ghost Fleet still patrolled even now. The answer was simple, and it was not any specific enemy, but the possibility of any enemy, and we prepared for the day when something out there would look at humanity and see prey. Her voice grew stronger, and the crowd fell absolutely silent. We learned from our own history that the universe does not care about fairness or justice, and that survival goes to those who prepare, and those who adapt, and those who refuse to give up even when the odds seem impossible. She thought about her grandmother, who had helped start Project Lazarus, and her mother, who had commanded the first Judgment-class vessel, and all the generations of humans who had kept the secret and maintained the vigil. The Vecturi believed they were predators, and they believed we were prey, and they believed that their power made them invincible. Admiral Tanaka smiled, and there was something ancient in that smile, and something forged in fire and carried through ice ages and plagues and wars that should have ended humanity 1,000 times over. They were wrong, because humanity is not prey, and humanity has never been prey. And we are the species that survived everything the universe threw at us and kept going. She spread her arms to encompass the crowd and the city and the planet and all of human civilization. We are the species that looked at extinction and said no. And we are the species that crawled out of caves and reached for the stars And we are the species that built weapons to fight gods, and then used those weapons to free a galaxy. Her voice rose to fill the air with absolute conviction. We are humanity, and we do not surrender, and we do not break. And we do not kneel. The crowd erupted in cheers that echoed across the planet and across the solar system and across the galaxy itself. Somewhere out there among the stars, the former subjects of the Dominion heard those words and took them to heart and began to rebuild their civilizations with new hope. And somewhere in the darkness beyond known space, other powers watched and listened and learned a lesson that they would never forget. Do not threaten Earth. Do not underestimate humanity. Do not assume that the small blue world in an unremarkable solar system is weak or helpless or afraid, because humanity has been preparing for you, and humanity will always be preparing, and when you come for them, you will not find prey waiting. In the darkness, you will find the species that conquered the conquerors. You will find Earth's final war fleet, and you will find no mercy. The galaxy had a new guardian now, and its name was humanity. The end.